Hurricanes and heat waves, fires, floods and famine. Evidence is growing linking extreme weather to global warming. As yet more UN climate talks start, this time in Qatar, we ask, where's all the hot air getting us in dealing with all the hot air? This is Inside Story. Hello from me, David Foster. Welcome to Inside Story. Nearly 200 nations are represented in Qatar discussing the fight against global warming. UN talks have actually been taking place for around about 20 years now, but as yet they failed to fulfill their main purpose to actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Rob Reynolds has been looking at the effect that could be having on our weather.
The ravages of Hurricane Sandy may top $50 billion, making it one of the costliest storms ever. No single weather event can be blamed solely on global warming, but scientists at places like the Earth System Science Center at the University of Maryland are drawing conclusions about the connections between extreme weather and the warming atmosphere.
Here's an example.
Antonio Busolacci is the center's director.
There's no doubt that the background climate around the world is warming. On top of that warming trend, we're going to have extreme events. And the two are actually conflated together.
Busolacci says there's no way to slap a price tag on climate change.
It's hard to price or monetize the cost of climate change because we're talking about a problem that has a timescale of decades.
And yet, efforts to enact a national climate policy remain stagnant. What is wanted, economists say, is a way of reflecting the true cost of pumping carbon into the air.
What we really do need is to look at something that's more broadly based in the economy. A carbon tax is probably the simplest way to do it.
In President Barack Obama's first term, efforts to set a cap on carbon emissions and require companies to pay for emissions over their allowed limit failed to get through Congress. The administration has cut emissions with higher energy efficiency standards for vehicles and appliances. But in his first post-re-election press conference, Obama said more progress won't be easy.
There's no doubt that for us to take on climate change in a serious way would involve making some tough political choices. If the message is somehow we're going to ignore jobs and growth simply to address climate change, I don't think anybody's going to go for that.
The science, economics, and politics of global warming are complicated, but one conclusion is simple. If we just keep doing what we are doing now, it's likely only going to get worse. Rob Reynolds, Al Jazeera, Washington.
And we have been doing what we've been doing since 1990, when a UN panel concluded that man-made greenhouse gases were increasing the temperature here on Earth. They called for action. After 7 years of negotiations, the Kyoto Protocol was born. It was a difficult birth. All the world's industrial nations signed on, promising to reduce emissions to below 1990 levels, and the accord finally took effect in 2005. But, and it's a big but, by then it was greatly watered down. The US, which initially had signed on, didn't ratify the deal and doesn't have to meet any of the accord's targets. And China, the world's biggest polluter, is not required to reduce emissions. The Kyoto Protocol expires at the end of this year. That's why this meeting in Qatar is so important. So what comes next? That is what this summit is all about, which brings us to the question we'd like answered. What do these climate talks actually achieve? In Doha, at COP18, that's the name of the talks, Pa Hausman, chair of the least developed countries, which is made up of 48 nations that work together in the negotiations. Also at the conference, Anjali Appadurai from Earth in Brackets. Angela, I'll ask you about the group's name a little bit later on. It's a youth organisation dedicated to sustainability and making the UN more accessible. And joining us from Brussels, actually, Bas Eickhout, member of the European Parliament from the group of Greens. Welcome to all of you. Bas, if I could come to you first of all. You're in Brussels, you're not in Qatar, so instead of there being 17,001 people attending this conference, it's 17,000 at the moment. I know you're flying over here next week. Why does it take so many people to do what seems to be so little?
Well, the second part is more difficult to answer. Why it needs so many people is because you've got 200 countries, so 200 negotiating teams. They fly over to come together in Qatar. So that's already, of course, a lot of people being there. But at the same time, and that's always these climate conferences, they have two parts. They have the official negotiation part, and they have at the same time a meeting of companies, NGOs, and they are, around those negotiating teams, putting pressure on them to deliver. So that in total is delivering these huge amount of people over there. Why it is delivering so little is, of course, a good question, because I would like to see far more to be achieved in these climate negotiations. But in the core, this is a climate problem that is being caused by the rich countries, and they don't suffer yet that much about climate change. It's the least developed countries. They suffer from it, but they haven't really contributed to it. So you really see it is at the same time, it is a core issue talking about our energy use, and it is also really a distributive problem. The ones who are causing it can deal with it, and the ones who didn't cause it, they are suffering from it, and that is really the core problem of this issue.
Anjali, I see you nodding your head. I said I was going to ask you about the name of your group, Earth in brackets. Why that name?
In political texts, brackets are meant to denote pieces of the text that are contested or unable to be agreed upon. And so until a text has come under consensus, the brackets remain there, and the text as a whole is unable to be adopted. So it's a play on words, and it's just basically saying that we've put our Earth into brackets, and it's going to stay there until negotiators decide to do something, to take action on climate change.
Yeah, but Baz was saying that it's not what you see necessarily on the piece of paper at the end of the day, the communiques, what's official coming out of it. It's what's done in the corridors, away from the main meetings. And I imagine that you're trying to twist a few arms at this conference. Is it easy to do that?
As youth, definitely not. But I think a big part of what happens here is the messaging and the narratives that are coming out of here to the rest of the world. But I think your question goes back to actually the function of this space, the UNFCCC space, the UNFCCC being the Climate Convention. And I think, this gathering of 17,000 people, as you said, is the culmination and the extreme pressure point and the result of a year of negotiations, and most of the work has been done in that year. So it's necessary to have this highly pressurized environment and things happening inside the meeting rooms and outside of them in order to make anything happen. Of course, that's not to say that there should be private meetings happening between selective parties, and that's an unfortunate part of the process as well. Yeah,
the acronyms are quite baffling. You talked there of the UNHCCC. Maybe there's another C. I can't quite remember that. That's the overarching group. But COP. Why COP18? It took me about 10 minutes to find this out today. It's the Conference of Parties allied to this UNHCCC thing. So it's all rather confusing. Let's go to Pa Ausman. Baz was mentioning there that it's a terrible imbalance. You have the rich countries kicking out the most of the rubbish that's causing the pollution and possible climate change. You have the poor countries who are suffering as a result. Everybody wants to make sure that their agenda gets on the table. Are there real villains for people like you from the least developed countries, people you are having to fight time and time again?
Yes, I mean, if you consider the issue at hand, you would realize that the people who are responsible historically are not really keen. The political will is not there. We were just mentioning about the United States, which is historically responsible for this, but yet still most of them are in denial. If you look at the industrialized countries are spending over $400 billion on fuel subsidies, and all we need is at least $200 billion per year to solve the issues of climate change.
But Barack Obama, we heard him there, he was saying jobs or climate change, it's a no-brainer, we have to have jobs. So how do you and the group of least developed countries go about trying to persuade somebody who has that much influence and that much pressure on him from American industries. How do you go about getting them to change their mind?
They have to realize that historically they are responsible for this. And the job creation that he's referring to, I mean, if we go towards a low carbon development path using renewables, it also creates jobs. And this is a justice issue also. The United States, as the leading country that is advocating for democracy and human rights, should also consider that climate change is a human rights issue, is a justice issue.
But do you sometimes feel that they're just nodding politely at you because they know they have to talk to you, and at the end of the day they can turn around and say, yes, of course we take on board what you've said, and walk off and do something entirely different, carry on the way they were?
That is true, but now they are also feeling the impact, and you can imagine people in New York and New Orleans staying for 2 weeks without electricity, and this is what our communities are facing every day throughout the year. So let them understand that the impact that they have felt during those 2 years, 2 weeks or 1 month, is what millions of people in poor developing countries have been facing over the years and would continue to face if they don't change their lifestyles to ensure that the rest of the world also improve their livelihoods, their communities and their countries that are losing their existence.
Possibly the argument is getting through, but because it's actually coming home to roost for some of the people in these countries. Let's take a look at a list of the worst polluters there are. China and the United States far and away at the top of the list. China's the planet's most populated country. It emits the most greenhouse gases, some 6 billion tonnes a year. Now that has gone up by 171% since the year 2000, 171%. The US, which is the world's biggest economy at the moment, produces more than 5 billion tonnes, but its emissions are actually down since 2007. Now India, the boom there's made it the third worst emitter of greenhouse gases, pumping out nearly 2 billion tonnes of CO2 every year. Russia next, more than 1.5 billion tonnes of emissions. Anjali, let's go to you because you've been trying to say something for the last 2 or 3 minutes. I don't know whether it's because you agree or perhaps disagree with something I've said, but what was it?
No, I'd just like to add some context. Just in terms of those numbers, so China being the largest emitter, if we add context to those numbers, the developing countries in that list are China and India. And if we look at the actual per capita emissions, if you break down that 6 billion gigatons figure, it's a fraction of the per capita emissions of that of the US. That number is growing because they are developing nations and they haven't gone through the path of industrialization that the US and the EU have gone through. That path of industrialization is what has made them the major emitters of today. So we're dealing, it is very much, as the other two speakers said, very much a question of equity and justice. So it's not really about just admonishing the US for, political bad behavior. It's about understanding that this whole convention that the US is technically legally bound to because they are parties to it is based upon a set of values. And those include very strongly historical responsibility, accepting the historical emissions that have contributed to the majority of the emissions we have in our atmosphere. Secondly, common but differentiated responsibilities and understanding that countries are responsible to different levels for taking climate action. And third, polluter pays. If you have contributed to 2/3 of the atmospheric emissions, there is some sort of morality tied to that to mandate that you should be the one paying for that. And,
but I'm going to go to Baz on this point, morality.
Yeah,
and Anjali talks about morality here. It's all very well saying somebody should feel ashamed of what they're doing, but you have to be able to persuade them that it's in their interests to change, and that's a difficult job, isn't it?
It's indeed a very difficult issue, the morality of the cause, because exactly the differences between China and the US, they are showing the complexity of this problem. I mean, very clearly, from a historic perspective, the US is for 25% responsible for what is in the air right now. So that they should be moving first, which is a demand from China, is a very true demand. However, from an American perspective, they look at China as their big competitor, economically speaking, and they look at the emissions now, which indeed is now at the top of China. So they say, well, China has to move at the same time as well. So what you see is exactly what we have seen the last couple of years. It's China looking at the US, you move first, and US looking back to China, no, you have to move first. Well, you can do that for ages, you know, looking at each other in the trenches, not moving at all. So you need someone to start moving and persuading the others to join. And that is exactly very difficult because, and then from a European perspective, I'm from the Parliament at the European level, I am always pleading that Europe should be the first mover and then persuade China and the US to follow. But now, given the euro crisis, the economic crisis the EU is anticipating, you see that the EU is giving back on that leading role. So you could say in 2008 and 2009, the EU was leading. But if you ask me now, I really sincerely doubt whether we as Europeans can still say that we are in the lead. Maybe in our legislation, yes, but not in the international negotiations, because what do we have to offer now? And that's making it's a kind of a stalemate for everyone. China, US looking at each other, Europe looking at itself, no one really taking the lead. And that is exactly the problem we are having right now.
Yeah, Per Ausman, representing the least developed countries. There's inequality too in the amount of money that you've got behind you. In other words, in terms of lobbying, the big industrialized countries have got so much more pressure that they can exert. Do you find yourself sort of pretty much unable to compete in terms of the oomph you can give it?
Yes, we over the years since 2001, when we agreed on launching a process for the implementation, formulation and implementation of national adaptation programs of actions in the least developed countries, the 48 countries of least developed countries all prepared their NAPAs, which are the adaptation programs of actions, for funding, and what is envisaged as a total of 570 projects would cost almost $5 billion if you calculate and consider even the co-financing component. So right now we need $3 billion to implement those programs of actions, which is being programmed and supervised through the GEF, which is the financial mechanism of the convention. Right now we have $537 million in the LDCF
so what is that?
fund.
That's
for the
just about 1/10 of what you need.
Fund, that is just 1/10 of it. We have access 380 out of that. And 2 weeks ago, I was in the GEF Council meeting where I pleaded for more funding, and we had countries that pledged up to $63 million towards the fund. But we are still appealing to industrialized countries to continue supporting us, because this was something that was meant to be implemented 10 years ago.
Yeah, promises. I mean, how much do you believe of what you're told?
Out of the $30 billion that was promised in Copenhagen from 2010 to 2012, only 21% of it went to adaptation. And findings have also indicated that 23% of the pledge is new and additional. So the rest is ODA and recycled, and some are even loan. 24% of what they have pledged is loans. We are the most vulnerable. Our countries are feeling the impacts of climate change. We are poor. We are really struggling to meet our budgetary requirements, so we cannot take loans to address the impacts of climate change that we are not responsible for. I think morally, it is imperative that the Annex I countries fulfill their commitments and also ensure that the financial gap that they need to fulfill is adhered to.
I'm going to read out for you three and also for our viewers at home the reaction we've been getting on Al Jazeera's Facebook page on this subject. Teddy T. Volkel says, I'd like to see my stupid country, the US, finally wake up to the fact of global climate change so that real progress can be made. Denial is a waste of the whole Earth's time. But Mikhail Zuber posted this: I hope nothing will happen. Global warming is nothing more than a clever swindle purposed to drain countries' budgets on pointless research and doesn't allow developing nations to grow. Hadi Masuri offers this view: my apologies, but man has altered the planet. What we do now has an impact. At 7 billion souls who consume resources, and at an alarming rate it can tilt delicate balances that sustain us. The truth is, how do we save ourselves, not the planet? And Ayakin, I hope I pronounced that correctly, Ayakin Godwin adds, no matter what we say here will not change their plans. This meeting is just about politics, and that's all. Baz, let's go to you in Brussels. Is it just politics? Is it just people getting a global platform for pontification?
No, I don't think so. Although I do understand the cynicism that's a bit behind these messages, of course. It's like they've been talking now for 18 years, and what have we achieved? So in that sense that some people say, well, it's another waste of money that they're going over there, I understand it. But at the same time, it is changing our energy system. It is changing the way we are dealing with our lives now. And we have to do that in a global world where the distribution problem is so divided, where it's so different. I mean, that is really why these negotiations are so slow and are so difficult. But it would be too cynical if you would say, oh, just skip these kind of global negotiations, because in the end, we have to get out of it together, and we are in this world together. So in that sense, we have to deal with it together. But yeah, indeed, I mean, everyone is coming from different perspectives. The world has become very diverse. It's not poor world against the rich world anymore. It's far more diversified, and I think that's making it more difficult. But in the end, we need to solve this together, really.
Anjali, if there was one thing, and I seriously mean just one thing that you would like to see come out of this COP18, as it's called, what would that one thing be?
It would be a strong rules-based system with real substantive targets going into 2015. And that has to happen in Doha.
And from what you've heard so far, is there any chance of that?
Yes. You know, in this discussion about the UN Forum, we cannot stress enough the importance of national action, collective action, pressuring governments at home. But at the end of the day, this forum is the only place at which there's even the potential of achieving any kind of international collective action on climate change. And so there's no other place where all 190-something countries can come together and hash this out. This goes back to this gridlock we were talking about, seen in the light of developed countries falling far short on finance, on emissions reductions, on the original values of the original convention. When seen in that light, to me, this doesn't seem like a gridlock that's politically justifiable anymore. I think we need the UN Forum to create that collective action and pressuring the Annex 1 or rich industrialized countries to move
Osman, that. We're coming towards the end. Let me just put a point to you. Do you feel that you're likely to walk away from this feeling that you personally and your group may well have achieved something that could change the world?
We are very optimistic that we would leave Doha with a very successful outcome. First, in ensuring that we have a second commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol. That is the only legally binding, internationally legally binding regime. And we would also start a new regime that would involve every party, everybody to take a fair share based on our common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. And you have alluded to the China-United States issue here. I think it is important to have this within a context. The Chinese population has to be taken into consideration, the per capita, and there is no way that we can consider and factor present and future emissions without taking on board the past emissions.
Indeed.
What is important is that
extremely complex, far too complex, I have to say, for us to come to any sort of reasonable conclusion on a half-hour programme such as this. But I think the general feeling is that it isn't just hot air. Something can be achieved. Thank you to our guests, Pa Osman and Anjali Appadurai here in Doha, Bas Eickhout in Brussels. It must be good They keep coming back.
Welcome.
And thank you for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. Please post your thoughts on the Al Jazeera English Facebook page. Good to read some out just then, and follow us on Twitter. Our profile is at AJ Inside Story. For me, David Foster. Bye-bye for now.